cultural fascination with the world of organized crime fascinates me. In reality, there's not a lot to admire. They coerce, kill, end families, lie, steal, and display a naked ambition for power. And yet the stories we tell about them show a devotion to a craft, priority to family, a simple faith that says, God protect me, even if not, God lead me. Aspects of masculinity and femininity are kept intact, although they may be poisoned versions, rags to riches, etc. I'm thinking of The Godfather, as I assume you are too, and Breaking Bad, right? And even some of the earlier bad boy stories from like Dashiell Hammett that we've covered on the show. We know intuitively the evil here, and yet part of us wants them to win. I've always thought of Scarface. Oh, Scarface. Okay, yeah. For example, as a tragic cycle, we know Tony must inevitably fall, but we're still sad for him when he does. Why do you think we are so drawn to these stories we would never advocate as paths for our sons? Okay, this is a great question. I kind of wish that I had had this question when we were doing Aristotle and the development of the Athenian constitution, because I was talking there about tribalism, right, and mob bosses and gangs, and the oldest thing in the book, right? And so part of it has to do with its being the oldest thing in the book, that it's actually a later and refined and more civilized way of doing things, to have that isonomia, to have that equality of law, or to have a law to which you refer, rather than to come to Don Corleone for justice, right? That's the whole point of the opening of scene of that movie encapsulates, I think, a lot of what we yearn for. Think about The Godfather. The Corleones have come to America. Many Italians have come to America, right? And they have left a country in which, in many places, right? If you read like modern Italian novels, like the Neapolitan Quartet by Elena Ferrante, kind of really dramatizes this well, that like even efforts to get out of the cycle of violence kind of end up back in the cycle of violence. And so you have this, like these towns, these, where you heard, you kill my goat and then I steal your daughter, and then the family is now anew, but suddenly violence from your son, right? This whole thing. And there is something earthy, right, about that. There's something very vital. There are vital energies that we get disconnected from the more we kind of abstract away into these pure forms of justice. And that's the point. That's why The Godfather is, in some sense, the great assimilation story, or the story, at least, of it's the great assimilation anxiety story. And you can kind of hold it up against Get Out, which is the more recent kind of social horror, the Jordan Peele movie. Two stories about the anxiety of assimilation, right? And of the things that you lose, right, by stripping yourself of these local particularities, these devotions and these allegiances, right? You don't even call me Godfather. That whole scene, it's all in there, right? And Michael's kind of journey. Remember, he comes back wearing the uniform, right? He comes back to that wedding. Al Pacino, young Al Pacino, very dashing, wearing that military uniform. That's the symbol, right, of kind of dissolving some part of your individuality or your national heritage in the acid bath of assimilation. And there are good and bad versions of this, and we've talked on the show about the fact that it is possible to maintain a kind of connection to these earthy forces and desires while still affirming America as a creation. America is actually not a landless or a peopleless nation, despite what you may have heard. But undeniably, the assimilation story, the immigration story is in part the story of traveling away from your old tribal allegiances and into a new world. And that new world, unless it retains some of those old ways of living, those cultural traditions, is likely to seem very cold and empty. And this is why masculinity and femininity, which have these real urgent characters to them, are part of what gets stripped away in a hyper-modern era, right? So I think that's a big part of what we're responding to, and that especially the masculinity part of it, which I've talked about a lot before, the virtu, which is not so much ethical virtue as just the sheer force of daring do, which can be oriented in one way or another. And this is why Aeschylus Eumenides is a great text, because it's not about rejecting or exiling the Furies, these kind of forces of chthonic underground power and attachment and recrimination. It's about converting them, right? It's about baptizing them in some sense, although of course they wouldn't have put it that way, right? It's about transforming them and orienting them in the right direction toward, finding the right outlet for your masculine anger and thumos, right? Finding the right outlet for your feminine care, right? These sorts of things, and your family attachments, right? and how to integrate those into a society where the law is sort of detached from all of that, as indeed it must be, to be a neutral arbiter. These things are never perfect, right? But we do travel toward them, and that's what the last week's episode was kind of about, just as the Eumenides is kind of about that. And I think that our yearning for these bad boy stories and these guys, this kind of raw masculinity, which we recognize as admirable, even when it's not virtuous, right? Like when Walter White kind of takes control of his life, there's something that we cheer for, as you say, even though we know that he's doing something terribly wrong that we condemn. It's because there's something missing from his life beforehand, and ideally, right, what you need is to recover that thing, but integrate it into the goods of civilized life. But when you're so far down the road of civilization and its discontents, sometimes the rawness and the urgency of something like a Godfather story can appeal.